Welcome, everybody. I'm Rachel Stern, Director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. We research, discuss, publish, and exhibit artists whose life and work were affected by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. With this work, we commemorate their lives and achievements. All our virtual programs are free of charge. Please help us keep it that way and join our summer campaign. You can find the link, you will be able to find the link in the chat function. Your support makes our work possible. Thank you. Today, I'm excited and honored to introduce two distinguished speakers. Dr. Hans von Trotha is a German historian, novelist, and journalist who spent 10 years as editorial director of the Nicolai Publishing House in Berlin, Germany. He just published Pollak's Arm, a very stimulating book of historical fiction, which brings us together today. Dr. Ori Soltes teaches at Georgetown University across the disciplines of theology, art history, philosophy, and politics. He's the former director and curator of the Nebret-Kluznik National Jewish Museum, where he curated some 80 exhibitions. He's the author of several hundred articles and catalog essays, and the author or editor of 25 books, including The Ashen Rainbow, The Holocaust and the Arts, Symbols of Faith, How Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Art Draw from the Same Source, and Tradition and Transformation, 3 Millennia of Jewish Art and Architecture, a book for which the second edition is forthcoming. Hans von Trotha will first read from his book, followed by a conversation with Ori Soltes. There will be time for Q&A, so please post your questions. Without further ado, I give over to Ori Soltes. Welcome, Hans and Ori.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with 3 real people and 1 fictional person. The 3 real people, of course, are Rachel Stern and Hans von Trotha, and the third, of course, is Ludwig Pollak, and Kay, who is the narrator of the extraordinary novel we're about to hear about and discuss, is fictional. The thing about this novel is it's all of 138 pages long, so it would appear to be small. And in fact, it's so wonderfully written that it is almost light reading, except that the subject matter is so heavy, it creates its own paradox. And what Hans von Trotha has done is interwoven history, specifically having to do with the Holocaust, archaeology, art history, literary history, the whole idea of literary structures and how in different ways, different kinds of novels are written. He's woven it all together in a rather extraordinary tapestry. The basis for his historical novel is the figure of Ludwig Pollak, born in 1868 and perished presumably at Auschwitz, because no one actually knows the disappearance, the end is the end, in 1943. Pollock was a classic Jewish figure out of the Germano-Austrian culture. He felt himself more Germanic, more Austrian than Jewish, and found when he came to the point in his academic career of seeking a career in academia, it was not, however, possible because of his Jewishness. So he switched in 2 different ways. He kind of switched gears. He chose instead to use his extraordinary talents as an antiquarian and an expert on antiquities to become an advisor, a dealer. He helped important figures pull together their collections. He wrote about their collections with extraordinary acuity. And he moved to Rome, where he spent virtually a half a century of his life. His wife, his children, all of them are in Rome. When the Nazis arrive, there are those aware in the Vatican of who he is and who feel that he needs to be rescued. They're aware in particular because he had discovered at a flea market an arm which, with the acuity of his eye, he recognized as the missing piece from a very, very famous sculptural group at the Vatican, the Laocoon. And so he gave it to the Vatican. He also, again, with that acuity of eye, found a piece that had been stolen from the Vatican decades and decades earlier and returned it to them. So he was someone they well knew about. and someone whom they might have wished to save, and therefore would bring to the Vatican territory, which of course was autonomous by definition because of the agreements that it had made, the Vatican had made with Mussolini's government to reaffirm earlier agreements back at the time of the Risorgimento. And someone is dispatched in the novel, an anonymous figure, to go to the apartment in the palazzo where Pollock and his family live and bring them to safety in the Vatican. And Pollock is not so interested in being saved. He's much more interested in talking about his life than worrying about his death. And it's this frame that has been filled in with such extraordinary and majestic colors and shapes by Hans von Trotha, to whom I now turn to lead us off by leading us off. Hans, the floor now becomes yours.
Thank you very, very much, Ori. And thank you, Rachel, for this invitation. I'm very flattered, very honored, very happy to be with you in New York, at least virtually, and to spend this hour with you. I also want to send my great gratitude, my thank you to Michael Wise, my American publisher, without whom we wouldn't be here either, because he published this book and he helped a lot to make it known and bring us all together. And he chose wonderful Elizabeth Laufer to translate it, which is not easy at all because it's a very special language. Liz, in case you are listening somewhere, it is your book as well. And I'm always very impressed by the great work you did here. So thank you very much for all that. Thank you, Ori, also for this kind introduction. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. And I decided to read a small passage from the very beginning of the book, how it starts. If the weather conditions had been better, that wouldn't have changed a thing. You're right, of course. An SS captain doesn't take his cues from the weather. The weather is more likely to take its cues from the SS. Wasn't the same once said of Goethe? Almost certainly. Perhaps you'd prefer to write it all down. If so, I leave you to it. The room is yours to use as long as you like. No one will disturb you. Time is one thing we have in abundance here in the Vatican. A small room on the ground floor, where little sunlight reaches the large double window. A modern desk lamp with a black metal shade casts its light on the keyboard of a bulky typewriter. Along the top of the carriage, Remington stands in peeling gold lettering. It holds a blank sheet of paper. Kay sits at the typewriter. Monsignor F, facing him, late on the afternoon of October 17th, 1943. Kay, a secondary school teacher from Berlin, stranded in occupied Rome and harbored in the Vatican, has come to this austere vestibule in a building near the German cemetery Campo Santo Teutonico at the request of Monsignor F, a retired prelate and ecclesiastical diplomat whose German is flawless, virtually accentless, except for a trace of Italian inflection. Kay, wiry and wan, seems tense. He looks tired. His blue eyes are opened wide, disproportionately large in his narrow face with its taut, pale skin. The Monsignor asks Kay if he would prefer to tell him his story or write it down. He would rather tell him, Kay responds, but isn't sure if he can, doesn't know where to start. Giving a personal account, that was something Pollak kept repeating, that we all have a duty to give a personal account. He kept stressing the importance of telling our own stories, passing them on. That was why he wouldn't let me leave. That was my chance, Kay says.
Wonderful beginning. And I'd like to divide my comments / questions to you, Hans, in 3 approximate kind of categories. I'm going to start a little bit with Pollock's biography, because obviously your awareness of it made this novel possible, before turning to some questions about what you did in the novel that are so particularly interesting and intriguing, and so on. We'll just follow along in what will be a kind of organic order. So my first question, it won't surprise you because I am an academic after all. So I am therefore very familiar with the effete snobbery, if I may use that turn of phrase in English, against non-academics that is ultimately, in my opinion, a result of insecurities and envy. And so I'd love a little bit of a teasing out of that issue with regard to the Academy's attitude toward the academically perfect non-academic Pollock, and how in particular contemporary academics, his contemporaries, viewed his relationship with individuals like J.P. Morgan. Please, comments.
Yes, the Pollock was an academic. He was kind of born as an academic. He loved the academy, and he studied archaeology. He was a great fan. That was the very German part of him, of Goethe. He read everything, he collected Goethe, everything. He was the most important academic in a certain way for him. And that led him to Rome. So academics and Rome, that was his Parnassus. So, and that is why he studied archaeology. And it was clear he wanted to become a professor. But then the Academy made clear, as a Jew, he will never be a professor. And that is why he became a dealer. And he became the most important dealer for antiquities in Rome. And he did something very interesting and very special. He kind of founded the medium of the catalog. He was the man who made the great scientific catalogs for all the big private collections in Rome. So he founded kind of an academic research beyond academy. And he was very aware of that. And he always stressed out, there is one big difference between me and you. As a dealer, I can't make a mistake because I'm off tomorrow. As a professor, you can do whatever you want. And that is why what you do is not deep. Only we do the deep things. That was he was very aware of this situation. And he created kind of his own library and was very important for archaeology at the time. But always in the position of a kind of underdog. Mm-hmm. And that was the pattern that went through his life and gave him a lot of energy, but also cost him a lot of energy.
And say a few words, if you might, about J.P. Morgan, since I mentioned him twice now.
Yes.
The audience, I'm sure, would love to hear about that and that aspect of what Pollock was up to.
Yes, J.P. Morgan came to Rome once a year. With kind of lots of people. He had a complete floor in the Grand Hotel, and people were lining up to meeting him. And he wanted to meet Pollock. Like all the famous people who came to Rome wanted to meet the famous Ludwig Pollak because they either had questions or wanted to have one of his very rare special catalogs, or wanted him to guide them through the collections and through the city. And Morgan wanted to have one special catalog. And Pollak gave him the last, he says, the last copy he had himself. And J.P. Morgan, he describes that in his diaries in lots of details, which is actually a novel by itself, because he describes all those people waiting and sitting around and trying to get further in the line. But Pollock, could pass everybody because Morgan was waiting for him. And he said, I am I will send you one of my catalogs when I'm back in New York. And Pollak said, I didn't expect him to do that today, but he did. So one day there was a big box with that. So even a collector and businessman like JP Morgan was very aware of the intellectual and scientific position Ludwig Pollak had.
Fantastic.
And it was very important for him to know that people realize that.
So your next novel is going to be Ludwig and JP, right? I want to ask you another question, but first, if you, with your permission, I'm going to read a paragraph from page 70, in case anyone has a copy with them, of this novel, where, of course, Pollock is in the midst of describing to Kay all sorts of things about himself. And then he writes, the years my family and I, it's about 3 paragraphs down on page 70. The years my family and I were banned from Italy, 1915 to 1919, were very dark indeed. That darkness lingered in our bones for a long time. How could it have come to this, I asked myself time and again, until I found out. It was an inconceivable confluence of hatred, envy, ignorance, and malice, a structure they built to oppose me. They were decent people too who stood by me, but ultimately it wasn't our dear old friends who came to the rescue. So my question for you is, it is obviously interesting that Pollock was banned from Italy in 1915, 1919. That's the middle of World War I, as an Austrian. And now after 50 years in Rome, he's about to be deported for different reasons, under different circumstances, neither as an Italian nor as an Austrian, but of course, well, as a Jew. What does home mean? What is home for Pollock?
That is one. That is a question indeed I asked myself while writing. And the passage is, thank you very much for choosing that, because for me, it's an important one. One question you might ask later or not ask, but many people ask themselves, why didn't I write a biography? Why did I write a novel? Basically, there are 2 reasons to write a novel instead of a scientific work. The one is only the novelist can bring us back to a moment without the knowledge of what is happening later. And that was crucial for the situation of this book. I wanted to create a situation where it would have been possible that he goes, that he will be rescued. But we know it didn't happen. And the second reason to write a novel is that you can try to imagine or reconstruct or invent emotions linked with the things that happen. You can't do that as a scientist. And this is, for example, this emotion is, I constructed this from me thinking about him and passages from his diaries. So that was the way I worked. For him, home was a thought, an emotion linked to intellectual thoughts. I almost said for him, Rome was Goethe. That was kind of a home for him, but of course, this is a virtual home. For him, home was art, was culture, was the culture we all share, the universal idea of antiquity, basically, but culture himself. And then he suddenly had a home which he didn't even expect. He had a wonderful apartment with a huge room with Baroque paintings on the ceilings, where he had his collection and where his children were born and where he started his career in the beginning of the century. And he was happy. And what happened? They demolished the building in order to be a new building for the Senate, for the Italian Senate. So he had a home and it was destroyed. So he found then he found a new home, but then he was banned from Italy because suddenly he was a German. It was what he wasn't at all. because he had enemies who envied his position. There were people who made careers, but he was always the one people would go if they really had a question. So your initial question after the academic situation is crucial, because he was so much kind of more universal than the academics. They hated him. And they had the possibility, some of them had the possibility to make life a real hell for him, because these 4 years he had to leave from 15 to 19 were horrible for him. His wife died. He had to wear the Austrian uniform. He had to go to the army. He was really, really unhappy, and he experienced, for the first time in his life, he experienced anti-Semitism in Vienna. That's where it started for him. And then he returned, and it took years and years and years to get his collection back. But he never came back to this great years he had in the beginning of the century in this first place, which was his home. The society didn't want him to have a home.
Yeah, genau. So he is, in a sense, for society, the archetypical Jew. He's the wandering Jew.
Yes.
They want him to be wandering. They don't want him to have a home.
And he did everything not to be. He did everything not to be the wandering Jew.
Right.
He did everything to be the contrary.
Exactly. And you by bringing up also your decision to novelize rather than biographize, you're now interweaving, as I would expect, given the work itself. We're interweaving two different issues. So my two next questions take us in two directions, but they both come out of the same, branches out of the same tree. You can choose which one. Well, no, I'll choose which one to ask you first. So here's the first one. And that, again, relates to something that you have just passed by observing twice, his love of Goethe, because you've got that wonderful passage. And again, if people are looking for pages, it's around page 60. Where I'm quoting from your novel. On the centenary of his death in 32, that's Goethe's centenary, Pollock offered to loan the city his autograph for an exhibit. No one wanted them, not from him. So he thinks of himself as more Germanic than the most Germanic of Germans, and the god is Goethe, and that's his god. And he is therefore, and as a collector, he's got some extraordinary stuff, so appropriate for Goethe's anniversary. Tell us about this. They don't want it. Just tease that out a little bit.
He had he had a collection which he self-describes in his diaries, that it had three focuses. One, antiquity, that is the high quality antique art. The second, Goethe, everything about around Goethe, and the third, Jewish life. And the third one, I'm sure we will talk about that later, was not a focus in his young years, and became more and more and more important, because the situation we were just describing made him feel like a Jew, feel in a very, very special way, and he did that, and he reacted to that. And the Goethe collection was he had a great number of autographs, and even two pieces of Goethe's original hair. I had one of them in my hands. The other one has disappeared somehow. Somebody has it, and they are very interesting because they have long lines of little papers where people say, I say, it is true that this piece of hair was his niece's one, and I saw how she gave it to, so that you can prove it. So it was very important for him not only to read these books, not only to know about him, but the sensation of material, of presence, that made him a collector. The kind of the unique aura of the original. That also was so important for him to find the arm. We are going to talk later, to know that this is the real piece that was missing. That he kept it in his bedroom for a year, the arm, before he brought it to the, because he enjoyed so much this presence of something. And that is why he collected all these Goethe things. He also, he wrote a play, Goethe in Rome, which even was translated into Italian, and it was published in Germany. So he wanted to kind of, to be his life to be a revival of Goethe's presence in Rome as an institution in a certain way. And then when this anniversary showed up, he offered his whole collection for an exhibition, and they said, no, thank you. And he was very, very depressed about that.
I would think so. Let me turn to that next direction, and you describe how as a novelist you can do certain things that a biographer can't do. So in this discussion, I can do certain things that a reader shouldn't do, which is that I want to bring up something that comes at the very end of the novel next, because it's such a microcosm of the richness of this work with all of its layers and layers. And that is the moment when Kay has brought back a few artifacts, so to speak, to Monsignor F into the Vatican, when he has finally left the palazzo, left the apartment, leaving Pollock behind, depressed as all get up, knowing that Pollock is all but doomed. And he's got letters, but then he also has this wrapped up in brown paper, this image. And so it's unwrapped. And of course, it's an image by the French artist, Hubert Robert, who used to be called Robert des Ruines, because he always did images of antiquity and he liked ruins from antiquity. And it was the finding of the Laocoon. So it's the moment that he imagined where the Laocoon that had been buried and hidden had been found, right? And then the Monsignor has this like instinct, and he very carefully with the, as you describe it beautifully, with the letter opener, cuts open behind the frame, and behind it, there's El Greco. And the El Greco vision, which is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, of Laocoon, and he describes it, and he's just telling Kay about it, you know, how it subverted Renaissance order, how Greco was in Rome at the time. And interestingly, he makes a slight misstatement, which is a statement. He said his real home was Toledo, but actually Toledo was a Greco's adoptive home, because he's born on Crete, and he is trained as a kind of late Byzantine artist. Then he goes to Rome, Venice, and ends up in Toledo. It becomes his home, where his whole new style is developed, and he subverts the Renaissance order of things. And okay, we think, all right, done. And then you have the Monsignors dig a little bit further, and behind that, there's something else. This piece of parchment, which Kay opines must be a fragment of Torah scroll from Prague that had come up, but it's been carefully, not cut, but torn, but carefully as a six-pointed star. And the Monsignor says, hey, did you know that the medieval Jews used this as an amulet? And Kay says, well, I didn't until Pollock told me. And incidentally, the six-pointed star, as the Star of David, first comes into prominence in the Jewish world in and around Prague, in Bohemian Moldavia. So tell me a little bit more about this spectacular, it's right near the end, the layering and its significance in your mind, right? Did this happen? Did you make this up? Either way, you obviously doted on it, because it's about 4 pages, which is why I didn't read it. Tell me about it. It's just wonderful.
Well, it's like the whole novel. It's a combination of made up and real. Obviously, both images are real, and what is also real is the story Pollock tells in his diaries that when he was young, he observed pieces of old Torahs being kind of buried at the Jewish cemetery in Prague. And he was very fascinated by that. And he was so fascinated by these old documents And he admits to himself that he stole a little piece of it and kept it as a memory. And so that is the true part. And I thought about when Kay leaves him, actually the whole situation could also be a dream or a nightmare or just made up. And I wanted to bring some item from the one room to the other room of the novel, to have a continuity of the two spaces and of the time. And so I wanted to integrate those two images, those two paintings into the novel because they are so very, very interesting. So there's Hubert Robert's Finding of the Laocoon, which is a heroic piece of the grand, sublime, late 18th century thing, nothing to do with the real situation. And it's interesting that the right arm, which was reconstructed in the 16th century, is even slightly too long because this is what he wants to show. And in contrary to that, this really, really disturbing El Greco painting, which is very special because El Greco actually only painted or mainly painted portraits, people. And this is the only classical antique subject he ever painted, and that is the Laocoon. But there's nothing of a concentrated group. It is kind of, everything is exploding, is getting, not only dying, it's disappearing. And one of the critics wrote, this painting kind of mirrors what is happening kind of to Pollock's life in a way. Yes. And I was looking for a possibility to integrate those two, and I wanted Pollock to have something to give Kay. He gives him kind of to think about him, to have in reality. And then I was kind of, I thought that could be that piece of the document. Well, and then I had to make up a setting that works on two desks. Yes. And that was the frame.
I also wonder about that.
Sorry, a plus. This is actually the only moment where the Monsignore gets kind of a character and acts. And I also wanted that. I didn't want to have him as a mute figure. In this moment, he is the one who takes over the investigation. Yes, indeed. And I wonder about that painting, that particular painting too. You know, I see potentially, perhaps, you have Laocoon and his sons. This is Pollock and his sons being devoured by the serpents of Nazism. And unusually, inexplicably, Greco, as the Monsignor points out, has three figures. Well, you can see two full figures and a face and a leg that suggests a third, observing, and he says, as if they're being entertained. And I thought, in the context of this novel, the Trinity, Christianity, the Christian world, watching the destruction of the Jews of whom Pollock is a symbol. And I wonder what you think of that as a, if you thought about that or what you think about that. Because also, of course, this is, lest we forget, it's a Holocaust novel. And you have all kinds of moments that remind us of that, because Kay's there in the apartment and he's getting more and more nervous because, and there's at one point, I think it's on page 57, there's this noise outside because suddenly it's gotten quiet because Pollock has stopped talking for a moment. He's gone to get something. And then Kay hears something outside and he thinks, no, it's safe. It's not, but it's a harbinger. So what do you think of all that? Of course, that is it, in the first place, it is a Holocaust novel, because that is what made me write it, was not his glorious life, not his finding of the arm in the first place. It was the end. It was the end of the life. And for me, it always mirrored all that was before. Also the question, if the arm of the Laocoon, so the reconstructed arm was a kind of heroic arm, it was stretched, and the one Pollock found was bent. And for me, that is the question, is it a hero or is it a victim? And for me also, that was the question, is Pollock a hero or is he a victim? Is somebody who decides, no, I'm not going to come with you. I'm going to tell you my story, but I'm going to stay here. And I don't know, I do know why. Is that a victim? No, that is, or is that a hero? Maybe also not. I'm not the one to decide that, but that is what I wanted to discuss.
Yeah.
And of course, you are right that this always brings up this kind of peculiar situation of the Christian society observing what is happening to the Jews. And in Rome, it was very special because people knew that it was going to come. That is the reason why maybe we should tell that K is invented. But there were two persons, and we know who it was, and we have their records, who really went there. They went there. Funny enough,
They're being to Pollock's apartment.
They went to Pollock's apartment. They obviously they even met there. One was kind of a spy and art dealer, and the other one was working in the Vatican libraries. And they said, we know that you are on the list. You, your wife, your son, and your daughter in the house. Son and daughter around 50 years old. 40 years old, sorry. We know you are on the list. Please come. But, and we know that happened. So that was not made up. That happened. People who were there talked to him and he said, no, I'm going to stay. And we know, and I tell a little bit about it, but I did a lot of research about it because it's very impressive, that this kind of scene happened quite often in those 24 hours in Rome, because a lot of Jews were saved, were rescued, were hidden somewhere, were not. There were more than 2,000 names of the list, and in the end, it was around 1,000 persons who were deported. But the other ones were rescued, which shows that there was a strong civil society who did not only watch, who acted. And that brings up the question, what did the Pope do? Because of course the Pope had this list. And there are even descriptions that some of the vans who were transporting Jews to the camp made the tour around St. Peter's Place in order to show the Pope what is going on. So it must have been a very, very tense and intense day, and he didn't do anything. I think, by the way, that there is a reason why he didn't do anything, because he contacted the German ambassador in the Vatican, and if he couldn't stop this whole thing, and this man said, no, I can't. This comes from Berlin, and I can't do anything. If I was you, I wouldn't do anything either. And I don't know if he said or just that was the white elephant in the room. So far, the Nazis had not taken the Vatican. Rome was completely in the hand of the Nazis. The Vatican wasn't. And so the Pope probably thought about who am I going to save? 2,000 Jews or my church? And I don't judge anything. I just try to describe what happened. So back to your question. Yes, it is this peculiar situation of becoming an observer, which happens when you tell a story like this. It also, also Kay is an observer. He becomes an actor because he realizes at a certain point, Pollak wants me to be the one to tell his story. So recording the story is not just observation, it is more than that. But basically, of course, you are right that these paintings mirror the situation. And
it's not accidental that that's toward the end. Toward the beginning, you start with reference to the Dreyfus affair, which is one of those modernist moments at the end of the 19th century in the aftermath of the disappearance, or so it was believed, of anti-Jewish sentiment, that it only transformed itself instead into anti-Semitism. And in France, in that particular case, a century after emancipation, this horrific case emerges, and that you have your protagonist from the first page as K. You chose that letter, not F, not L, not D, but of course, evocative to literati of Kafka, his character K in the trial in the castle, bewildered, not sure what's happening. Why is this happening? What am I doing here? Right? Not accidental, my son.
But it's two questions. The one is Dreyfus. It's of course it's not by chance that it's in the beginning. Because this is it is a long passage in Pollak's diaries, and it's one of the few moments where he has to correct his diary, because he for a day he thought things will become better, and then they turned worse. And I think that and so he introduces his position to the world as a diarist in the book with this example. Yeah, okay. To be honest, of course, everybody asked this, and I read one review in the US who had not only this one famous K, but a list of, I think, 7 or 8 Ks in German literature. So, of course, if you use this initial, you are in this tradition. Of course, you especially are, and I had this less in mind than in emotion, in feeling, yes, that we are talking about German Jews in Prague. That is the world we are in. That is actually what. And then I started writing, and I started using that initial without having made a decision. And then these strange things happened that I was not able to replace it because every other initial didn't work anymore. So it was there.
Fantastic. And you know, the novel and the biography, history and mythology, reality and imagination, history and historiography versus pure history. It's the imagination of the historian who analyzed the data and says, this is not only what happened, but what it means. I find it intriguing that the Laocoon, which is typically talked about as a Hellenistic work of sculpture, from my point of view, for reasons we don't have time to discuss, is a Roman work of sculpture because of how it is constructed. And of course, there are even those who thought that when it was uncovered in the 16th century, it was a fake. What do you think about all that stuff? I love it.
Well, yes. Also, I found out that there are 2 different myths of the Laocoon. There's the one we all kind of know. We read in Virgil tells us that it is part of the foundation of Rome. And that is why the Vatican was so keen to have it, because they wanted to refound Rome in Renaissance and so on and so on. And that is just to tell the myth that Laocoon was the only one who realized that the Trojan horse was a trap, and he threw his weapon against it. And that is why he was punished by the gods, because the gods wanted Troy to be destroyed in order to make Rome it possible to found Rome. So that is what we read and what we see in the sculpture. But there's another version. There's another version which is very, very simple and not that heroic. That that Laocoon, who was a priest, made love with his wife on the altar, and that was why he was punished for, which is a completely different situation, and it is simply not clear. When I started to work on the book, I thought, okay, there's a lot of research to do on Rome and a lot of research to do about on Pollock, because there is no biography. I had no idea that all the important questions around Laocoon are not clear as well. So it is a very, because it was broken when they found it, and maybe the reconstruction was not right, and a lot of things like that. So that is why this this statue has always been a place for projection, and also for Pollock it is, and also for me, of course, it is. So that is absolutely fascinating, because every time and every group of interest projected another story on this statue. Fabulous. And that is so the whole 18th century idea of archaeology, especially in Germany, like Winkelmann, Goethe, Schiller, the big Laocoon discussion, it's all this statue.
Yes.
And a detail is that Winkelmann, when he wrote this famous essay about it, he didn't even see the original. He saw a small copy in Dresden on the table. So it's a bit of Winkelmann bashing in the book, because this was a projection which influenced modern archaeology, has influenced until today, but it's a projection. And the arm, that is one of the questions that really became more and more important for me. Actually, the arm destroys this kind of projection completely. But the arm has been replaced in the 1950s, 50 years after it was found. And the Winkelmann story has never been revised.
Yes,
so
interesting.
You can say maybe the wrong story, which influenced us so deeply, is more important than the right story. That's a position which is, I think, is very important, because it's a founding myth of our idea of art history. But on the other side, I also ask the question, would it have been the same if it had been a Christian professor who found the arm and written 3 books about it?
Mm-hmm. Which brings me to my that's a brilliant last point, by the way. Last quick question, and then we'll open for questions. To come full circle to a comment you made at the beginning, which is translations. So you have a German, you have now an English translation, you have an Italian translation. Aside from the translation, how about the audiences of these 3 different, in a sense, versions?
Yes, and there's also, it just finished is the Spanish translation, and next year there will be a Turkish translation. The interesting thing is, of course, the text changes when it's, as every text does. The discussions of the book are very different in the different countries, in the different languages. Whereas in German, it is basically read as a Holocaust novel, as you called it. That is, in Italy, it's an archaeologic novel, a novel about art history, basically. And when I was in New York, and when I read the discussions, the reviews, and also the discussions I had with lots of people, also there happened a very interesting thing happens, that most readers in America, now also in England, read both. They read the Holocaust novel, but they also read the art history novel, and that brings them to talk about the literary construction, because that is what brings it together. And for me, of course, this is the most interesting kind of discussion, because I don't have to bring in the part that has been missing. Also, your comments were basically, and I'm very, very happy about the moments where those 2 meet. where it comes together, where it is interwoven, as you said. So yeah, the discussions are very, very different, and I hadn't expected that, to be honest.
Well, thank you so much for your answers and for providing the basis for the questions and the answers by just happening to write this little thing. And I'm turning it over to Rachel for questions. Thank you so much, Hans.
Thank you very much, Ori, for your questions.
Thank you so much for this really stimulating discussion and conversation. And we don't have much time left, but I asked our audience to please submit questions. And I'll start with Ilona, who says that she's very interested in the fact, Hans, that you mentioned about Pollak's collection becoming more focused on Judaism as he was made to feel his Jewishness more through anti-Semitism. Could you refer specific examples?
Yes, he was, in the beginning, he was collecting artifacts, valuable artifacts of Jewish life, which was fit into his collection. But then, after he was more and more forced to, be part of a Jewish life which was not integrated completely anymore, he also collected books. In the end, he only read Jewish books. And he makes lists of the books he reads, where he rediscovers these descriptions. And one of his most important, most valuable pieces of his collection was an old Haggadah, which he took on when he traveled and presented it everywhere because he was very proud of it. And he brought it to Geneva, to a bank, because he wanted to return to the Jewish community in Rome when everything is over, which did not happen. It is not in Rome. But that's an example for that became his most valuable thing in his collection.
Yeah. Well, and where is his estate? Did that stay in Rome, or
it was in Geneva, and now it is. To be honest, I knew where it was, but it was brought somewhere else. It is not in Rome. But I can find out. Yeah.
And which role did the museum play? I saw there was some probably also initiated by your book, some small exhibitions about Pollak in Rome for his 150th anniversary at the Jewish Museum, at the museum where he did work as a director. So do you feel that your publication of the story, that finally his story, Pollak's story, is surfacing and is being recognized now on a different level, both in Italy as in the Jewish world, as in art history, of course.
In art history in Rome, in the Bibliotheca Hertziana, for example, he was always very well remembered. And there was, you're right, there was an exhibition which was at the same time in the Museo Baracco, which is the museum he was the honorary curator and director of, and in the Museo Ebraico. And that was planned before I wrote my book, so that was independently. Also, there's a big project of transcribing and translating all his diaries, which are kept by the Museo Baracco. So there was, but this always was not a very, it was kind of more for specialists. And I was trying to tell a more popular story to get, because I think there are the aspects concerning, like Ori started with, the academic questions, but there also is this very human story, which is in all parts of it, not only in the end, but of course, especially in the end. And I was very, very interested in that. And his collection, everything he had when his family was deported. So his apartment, a huge apartment in the middle of Rome, was empty for 2 years. It was open and empty, and we don't know what happened in there. And it was it was a niece who inherited everything, and she sold most of it. And what she couldn't sell, she gave to the Museo Baracco. So that is, they have the diaries, they have a lot of personal items, they have all the Goethe autographs and the hair. So that was the first point where I went, and they were very supportive and very kind. Also, the Museo Ebraico was.
And is it true that the last piece of information we have concerning him and his family is that they're on those transports to Auschwitz? At no point between those 2 points when they might have been taken off, are they taken off as far as we know? And so they just disappear, as it were, into Auschwitz.
There are a lot of there are lots of rumors about that, because there were 2 days when the Jews were brought to a military hospital close to at the Tiber, and they spent there a couple of days. And there were people going in and out, and there were some people let free from there. And there are people who said that they had met Pollock there, which is kind of unlikely, but we don't know. And there even was a rumor that a cardinal tried to use his contacts to the Germans to get him out of the train. But I think this is just a rumor. But I even mention it in the book, because the fact that this kind of rumors exist means, first, that there was something going on, which was not, as you said, just watching, just observing. And the other thing, he was interesting enough and present enough to be, to be object of this kind of speculation, but we don't know.
Mm-hmm. So, but that kind of information might come up as all kinds of documents are being scanned now and made, you know.
Yes, I think, I very much hope that somebody will, or a group of people, or somewhere, a university will work on the big Pollock biography, because I think this is a very important biography which has to be researched and has to be written.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like archaeology, like the arm. You find a piece that no one has seen for 200 or 2000 or whatever years, and suddenly your sense of what a sculpture looked like or what a whole civilization was about changes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. So Wilfka has a question, which whether you know which Haggadah it was that Pollock was studying, owning.
You find it in there is a catalog of the exhibition in the Museo Baracco, and there's an essay and there are pictures about it. So it is very well recorded. So I would, and you will find that in the internet very easily.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So, and then I think we can conclude with the last mentioning or question by Phil. What do you think a conversation between Pollak and Goethe about Laocoon looks like? So that you have your next idea for a book, but I do believe you have a project already lined up. So.
Yeah, that's interesting, because Pollak himself was kind of in constant direct communication with Goethe, and I'm sure also about Laocoon, but he never wrote it down. So it's our all fantasies who have this field to write that down.
Nothing wrong with fantasy.
Not at all.
Creativity at all. Thank you so much, Hans. And thank you, Ori, for this great conversation. And thanks to your publisher, all our audience can purchase the book with a special 20% purchase until the end of the week. So I put the link in the chat function, and also it will be in our follow-up email that everybody receives tomorrow. So thank you so much again.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you, Ori, for this wonderful conversation. And yeah, thank you to everybody, and hello to New York.
Thank you so much. Take good care, everybody, and stay well.
Bye all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.